Greetings, adventurers. This week we're going to be talking about active exploits. This is a freely available on DriveThruRPG, Diceless RPG. Because it is freely available, I have a lot more liberty to use actual content from the book while I'm explaining how awesome this system is. It was developed by PIG, and one of its hallmarks is that you can actually use it to convert some of their other content into a Diceless system. It's useful for tabletop, LARP. You can play it online. You can really do any of these things, and part of the benefit of being Diceless is that there's no trust needed. If you just wanted to play a regular game, you could just do it over the phone and it would work flawlessly. Let's start by looking at the character sheet. You've only got a few options here. It's a simple single-page character sheet. At the top you've got your character name and then the setting. This has no guaranteed setting in it. It can be used to play anything. It could be a classic medieval fantasy. It could be your modern game, or it could be a futuristic game. You could play horror, you could play drama, you could play tragedy. It's incredibly versatile. It's kind of like the GURPS of Diceless RPGs. Then we're going to look at your abilities. There are 4 guaranteed abilities in this game, and there's also the option for other special abilities. The abilities are fitness, awareness, creativity, and reasoning. We're going to go over those deeper during character creation. We're also going to have 2 aspects, usually luck and discipline. Possibly more special aspects are available as well. Then as you make your character, you're going to need to decide on some principles and gimmicks. These help define the character, what drives them, and what can be used to manipulate them. There's a fairly long list of skills you could have in your game, but because it's a universal game, you could choose to pare them down, you could make some skills unavailable, and skills are also used for special abilities like magic or weird technology. Then you've got the options for equipment, which could be your weapons, your armor, but it could be larger things as well, like a vehicle, maybe even a warehouse you use as a secret base. There's space for your character's background, any notes you want to take on the character sheet if you so choose to. But the final thing to look into is the health track. You've got 2 different tracks, one for fatigue, one for injury. If your fatigue bar fills up, your character is going to start taking fatigue into their injury. Pretty straightforward. They both cause a penalty, depending on how injured your character is. In this core book, you've got a lot of options for how powerful the character is going to be, and it's suggested to have some type of session 0 in order to make the setting something that everybody wants to actually play. You could do this as just a quick way to interrupt adventures between your other games and turn to a Diceless setting. Say like you couldn't actually gather around the table or the VTT sometime. You'd convert any game you have into this looser system, and then via that you can play kind of text-based, if you wanted to. Good for an email campaign. The general way conflict is resolved in this game is you're going to have to fulfill tasks. Every task has a difficulty. Each of your abilities is going to have a certain amount of effort. So if you have your fitness at 2, that means you've got 2 points of effort you can spend into these different tasks. It's either going to refresh every scene or at the start of every round for combat. And you use those effort for both attacking and defending yourself. Skills give you free effort on tasks, so they're going to be renewable every time you use a relevant skill. You're just going to get that effort on your tasks. And aspects, such as your luck and discipline, can be used also to either protect yourself or change the circumstances or even also provide you additional effort. One of the very interesting things about this game is that in order to gain experience, you need to use your skills. Anytime you succeed on using a skill that is going to have been some type of challenge, you wouldn't do this for every trivial thing, you get an experience point. 20 experience points can be spent to increase that skill. You may also get experience by failing skills, so long as you did so in a creative or a way that pushes the envelope for that skill. In order to get new skills, it's somewhat unusual, but your character actually needs to put that effort in to get 20 points into a skill they don't already have. While abilities are very rarely increased, you can use 20 experience from any skill that uses that ability, and then with your game master's permission, you can increase an ability. Abilities typically go from -1 to 5. Not very high, but 5 is still considered superhuman. So in most games, it's only going to go up to 2. And that's the overview of active exploits. I look forward to showing you how to make a character next time. Greetings, adventurers. Once again, we're talking about active exploits. This time we're talking about powers. By default, there are really no powers in this game, but they give you the option of having a lot of different potential abilities. The closest thing the core game comes to having guaranteed powers are the luck and discipline aspects. You can spend your luck points in order to just increase your character's free effort. You can also use them to reduce the amount of fatigue or injury your character takes from anything else. Discipline, you can only spend to reduce the amount of fatigue or injury your character suffers from other effects, which could include pushing yourself too much. Using more effort than your character has discipline is going to cause yourself to become a little bit fatigued, and that's effort, not free effort. So your skills are not going to be accounting for that. There are also some additional optional aspects. These ones don't refresh regularly. It's going to have specific requirements to refresh depending on the aspect. The easiest one to understand is endowment. Your character has made a bargain with some type of entity, and that entity is going to endow you with additional social, spiritual, mental, or even physical power, which just gives you some additional effort you can spend. The way to get more is to renegotiate. There's regenerative metabolism. However much of this aspect you have, you can spend on a 1-to-1. To recover fatigue and injury, you recover your entire pool of regenerative metabolism at the start of each session. In this game, they call sessions episodes. And then there's aura. I personally wouldn't mind having a little bit more aura, but in this game, aura represents natural resistance to ESP. So just, you could spend this to make the difficulty of other people affecting you with ESP a little higher. In the core book, there are two groups of potential abilities your character could have, which are powers, actual powers. These are ESP, extrasensory perceptions, and conduction. In later versions, you can basically use these to modify or describe any of your available powers, but I'm going to open up and say that I don't really like how they call it ESP. To me, ESP should only describe your character's extrasensory perception, but here it also describes things like telekinesis or your ability to hypnotize people, and that just doesn't make sense. That's not a perception. So they should have a better term for this. They could just call it arcane ability, occult power, anything, but they decided to call it ESP. Because these are abilities, your character is going to be able to have up to a 2 in most games, moving up to 4 if your character is like the peak, the pinnacle of superhuman, and you spend effort in order to use them, while the skills within them are what's going to describe your free effort. Your character's actually capacity to use them in more controlled ways. The core skills for ESP are mesmerism, ability to hypnotize people basically just by touch or locking gazes with them. There's also telekinesis, which of course this is why I don't like that's called ESP. The difficulty of telekinesis is largely based off of the range, the distance between you and the target, and somewhat by the size of the target. And telepathy, which I think can fall into ESP if it's about reading minds, but they also use telepathy to describe your ability to send your thoughts to others. Again, this rubs me the wrong way a little bit. And then there's conduction. Specifically, conduction is your character's ability to absorb and control electricity. I'm really thinking about the infamous line of video games. This is what it feels like to me. And you could pretty easily just take conduction and say it's fire, say it's water, say it's air, say it's forces. Conduction would make more sense to me to be telekinesis than ESP, because they could just say it's for the psychokinetic energy rather than the mental energies. The skills for conduction are absorption, where your character actually gathers these energies, maybe to protect yourself or others, or to fuel the next two skills. That would be pulsing, which is erratic all around using of the electrical or electromagnetic spectrum in order to jam or send signals. Like, it sounds kind of like telepathy, right? Like your character is sending maybe this psychokinetic energy to other people. And streaming, which is where you're actually directing the force, the energy in a specific way. They would use this to either maybe make an attack or to overpower a system using that streamed power that you previously absorbed. And those are the core powers of the game. Welcome back, adventurers. We're going to talk some more about the advanced powers in active exploits, because you can use any power you want, anything you can think of, so long as it's within the setting and your game master approves of it. This could be more useful if you're converting from one system into active exploits to have one of those interim style games. One way you can make these powers work a little bit better is by using two of the optional rules. There's flares and accents. Anytime you have a positive flare, which could increase your ability by 1 or 2 or even 3, then you also need to have an equivalent number of negative flares, not necessarily in the same ability. The example they give is maybe your character is a little bit old, but he's got good hands. So he's got a +1 dexterity flare on his fitness ability, but a -1 flexibility flare on, same thing, his fitness. These can help your characters just achieve things so long as they have a net ability of +2 or more. If your narrative describes it accurately and you're using that flare, you just succeed, no effort expended, which can make the game a little bit faster, a little bit more dynamic, and not require spending points on everything. While accents use the flare system, they don't have a plus or a minus to them, and you don't necessarily need to have a positive or negative for that reason. They just describe limitations to the ability. The example they give is maybe your character has ESP, but they only have passive ESP. They can't choose to use their ESP for different detections. It just happens to come up, and that's it. Your character can't decide. Otherwise, there's active. Maybe there's touch ESP. Your character can only use the ESP if they're touching the target, so you can't be sending your senses out across the world. And I think that helps make this game feel a little bit better, especially when it comes to the more advanced powers that they suggest you have. In the arcane arts, you can actually just use the reasoning skills in order to explain how your character is using these powers. If magic is something that's natural in the world, and you don't need a special ability for magic, you can just use regular reasoning. It's like being a wizard. Or maybe you have channeling as an ability. This is your ability to channel different elements, and that way the flares would be whatever element your character can channel. Air, earth, fire, water, spirit, lightning, light, darkness, and there are different skills that can make channeling better or worse. I would, at core, just make it very similar to absorption, pulsing, and streaming, like the basic conduction ability skills. There are faith-based powers, which use an additional system called conviction. I'm not going to go into conviction. This is a short video, so I just want to say that there are faith-based powers as well. There's necromancy, which has specific skills for animating or otherwise controlling the undead, which I think is interesting. That's separate from channeling or any of the other arcanes. It's a specific ability of necromancy. And just briefly going to mention that there's manifestation, your ability to conjure and control spirits or help spirits exist on the material plane. And then transformation, of course, is your character's ability to change what they look like. Transformation is a very expensive power. In order to really turn into a wolf or anything, you're going to need to spend 3 points or so, and that's your points for the scene. So I'm not crazy about how transformation works in this game. I like shapeshifting. It's one of my favorite powers. So anyway, that's the briefest on more advanced powers. Basically, you can do whatever you want in this game. They give you some suggestions. Take it, use the toolbox, have fun. Welcome back, adventurers. And today we're going to be working on our character in active exploits. For character creation, the first thing you're going to need to do is decide the setting and scale of your either one-shot or campaign. This is a universal system, but they generally break things down as either fantasy, being more like ancient history, 1600s or earlier, antique, which is more like a Victorian era, steampunk would fit nicely into antique, modern, which could be either like super early modern, 1900s, 1950s, 1970s, or it could be today, it could be a little postmodern, and what we think is the speculative future, or it could be sci-fi. Of course, these are generalizations. Every genre is going to have its own timeline. After you've got some idea of your setting, then you can choose your scale, which can either be dramatic, heroic, or epic. The scale is going to impact how your character is created, as you can see by the table here. Assuming we've got a setting and a scale chosen, then we're going to, of course, choose a character identity. We should have some kind of concept we want to fulfill in this game. And what we can do is we can take concepts from other games and we can apply those. Active exploits is excellent for converting characters into it because of its fluidity. And that's going to start by choosing your character's abilities. You're always going to have at least 4 abilities in this game, but you may have additional abilities. The first suggested option ability is influence, which represents your character's potential in social situations. The ability fitness represents your character's strength, agility, and overall physical health. Awareness represents your character's intuition, observation skills, and general ability to use their senses. Creativity is your character's personal, spiritual, or artistic affinity and ability to or their inspiration, originality, and style. Reasoning represents your character's mental acuity, logical deduction, rational thought, and memory. Then there are aspects. While the abilities are going to be giving you effort that is going to replenish at the beginning of every scene or every round, aspects have their own individual refresh points. You can start with your abilities at lower scores. A -1 will give you additional things to spend your starting points on, and that can include increasing your aspects. But abilities and aspects are both going to have individual capacities depending on your scale. Next are the skills, which will give you free effort when they apply. These have brightest flat. It's either going to be your character is unskilled, they're a novice, they're a professional, or they're an expert for +1, 2, or 3 respectively. Depending on your scale, your character is going to have a certain number of proficiencies that they're going to have in the different skills. Next up are gimmicks, which are special ways your character can use the skills. And then perhaps most interesting of all is your character's principles, which will help define them as an actual character and not just a series of numbers on a page. The types of principles are going to be codes, which defines how your character acts and responds to different situations. There are objectives, which describes what your character wants to accomplish. And there are faults, which are flaws that help develop your character as a living and bleeding person. And that's it. Character creation is pretty straightforward. You can do this for anything, but I do want to mention that because it's a universal system, they have a lot of optional rules. The optional rules help expand on these, especially having different abilities. You can have skills and abilities with additional options within them that can subdivide them, but this is just the super simple basic character you could possibly have. Happy gaming to you. Greetings, adventurers. This is the last video for active exploits, where we talk about conflict resolution focusing on combat. The basic idea is that typically everybody's going to be acting simultaneously in combat unless you expend effort, usually from awareness or athletics or fitness, to make your character act first or before other people. You can take multiple actions per turn. Turns are usually extrapolated to be 5 or 6 seconds long, and you need to resolve the first round, and then you can resolve the second round within that turn. So if your character wants to stand up from being prone, that's one action. You might not even have to take any effort. And after that, you could do whatever you wanted to do. Maybe you wanted to kick somebody, hit them with some brass knuckles, or cast a spell. Then it's going to be actions and defenses. So your actions could be using a skill. You just use that skill. You use the appropriate effort to do so. Compare it to the difficulty. If you succeed, you succeed. For attacks and defenses, you, of course, are going to be referring to whatever attack is appropriate. If you are using some type of melee weapon, use the appropriate skill, and then the enemy can defend. Athletics is a catch-all skill for defending oneself in this game, so it's a very valuable skill in that regard. And after you hit them, you can spend luck points to increase the damage. Typically, basic unarmed attacks are only going to be causing fatigue damage, and if you have an overkill, if you succeed more than necessary, then that can increase the damage by 1 or 2. That applies to any weapon, but should really only be limited to overkill of 1 or 2 damage above the weapon's grade. There are just a couple of tables, some charts to show the typical armor. Armor is going to directly reduce the damage from any attack if it would defend against that attack. Like, you're not going to be very safe using certain types of armor against certain type of weapons, but other things are very effective, especially when you get into high-tech armor. And that's basically it. It's pretty straightforward. Might seem a little bit crunchy. You've got these tables to refer to, but if you've been in gaming for a long time, you're not afraid of tables, are you? So, looking forward to sharing the next Diceless RPG with you and showing some of my loadout. Happy gaming to you.